Hey there, old souls. It's Dr. Jonathan again. And we're going back into the woods. And today we're talking about surrender. Surrender is become it's become one of these topics. I guess you'd call it a crossover topic. Surrender has been a central feature in spiritual traditions forever, quite literally, since the beginning of any human record. Any writing about spirituality has always involved some core principle that sounds like or looks like surrender. Now that can mean a lot of things, right? That can be linguistically, that might sound like faith, which is actually a surrender principle. It might be about trusting in the elements or God or a higher force. But if it involves the understanding that we have to release our own will in order to really find peace with the world around us, or harmony with the world around us, or awakening is another term we might use, then we can consider that to be something that's exploring or points us towards surrender. And yet, surrender in the last, I'd say, decade has really become a much more prominent principle in psychology, in personal growth, in business development and leadership. Surrender is this principle much in the same way that while in contemporary settings doesn't really involve God or a spiritual world, it certainly involves the same personal practice of letting go of control, letting go of expectation. And of course, these contemporary uses or applications of the surrender principle are heavily influenced by Buddhism. And of course, we find that right at the heart of Buddhism, in even the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha, some of the core original teachings, is the idea that clinging, attachment, desire, willfulness, whatever is the opposite of surrender, that these qualities are at the root of our suffering. So today, I would like to begin by inviting you to consider, very simply, where are you experiencing struggle in your life? Where are you experiencing stress in your life? And can you track it? Can you find clinging, attachment, expectation at the heart of that suffering? I'd probably guess yes. And in fact, even if the suffering is beyond your control, so it's physical or it's environmental, is there some element of attachment that is making it worse, right? Wishing it would go away, wanting it to be different, all these kinds of things. Now, what I'd like to draw your attention to is why surrender is often so hard. And I'll tell you, for me, it's hard because I find myself caught up in what I think is probably a pretty modern problem for spiritual seekers and psychologically savvy people alike, which is that surrender often feels like giving up. It often feels like giving in. And it often feels like it's the opposite of what we've all been told is necessary if we are going to attract or manifest a change. I don't know that that's actually true. I think a lot of the great manifestation teachings, in fact, I'd argue the only ones that really have any value or work, are the ones that understand that one of the principles or steps involved in potent manifestation is the step of turning it over to the universe, turning it over to God, letting it go absolutely. which of course is a paradox for most people, because that means we need to be absolutely committed to something, absolutely focused on something, absolutely energized by our passion for it, and yet at the same time somehow be okay with not getting it. At some level, be okay with not understanding it. At some level, recognizing that we are powerless in this moment of claiming something with absolute certainty. Like, that sounds insane. And yet, I experience that is exactly what we're talking about. To have the motivation and drive that comes from the heart with an openness and a release of control that comes from the mind. So we're really talking about different aspects of self when we're talking about one part of us is committing absolutely and one part of us is essentially letting go. I think the way you reconcile that is to understand that the passion is in the heart, but the mind understands the vastness of perspective and possibility, and really I'd argue where all, it understands where all things come from and places the future squarely in that context. So this is the first struggle with surrender. Can we pursue something and let it go at the same time? Absolutely. A great analogy that was shared with me recently on my podcast, that it's not posted yet, an incredible scholar of Chinese medicine, Sabine Wilms, says that this yin-yang dance, yang being the passion, the commitment, the dedication, the willfulness, and yin being the surrender, the letting go, she said it's kind of like fishing. You get all your gear, you go to the right place, you study the most sensible and optimal way to do it, and then you just sit there and see what life delivers you, see what happens. I think that's a great metaphor for what we're talking about. But then there's this other metaphor, and I just brought you to a place that I think embodies it incredibly. For me, when I'm struggling with something like work or a relationship or a life change, the way I relate to surrender is maybe through the filter of knowing. That's helpful, because knowing sometimes leads to controlling, clinging, feeling like we understand what something's going to be. And yet, to not know is kind of like this, right here. It's just about entering a clearing in the forest. It's not a vulnerable place. It's not a dangerous place. In fact, it's interesting to consider that this place of not knowing and this place of not having or controlling or predicting is a beautiful place. It's a peaceful place. It's a patient place. And yes, if we have wounding in our history, fear in our mind or our environment, well, then we may misinterpret this incredible space of potential and potency as a vulnerable space, which is kind of profound, because vulnerability and surrender are really almost synonymous, right? They're almost two different words for the same thing for many of us. And yet I would argue that the kind of vulnerability that emerges when we surrender and the kind of surrender that emerges when we're vulnerable is really anything but weak, anything but fragile. It's to move into a place of extreme and ultimate potential. For me, that's the great reconciliation. That's how I find peace with surrender. It's to understand and participate in the flow of the universe itself. However you understand that higher power, life, the cosmos, God, spirit, the spirit world, it's about understanding that we are at best co-creators, and that doesn't make us less than or powerless. In fact, it brings us into an immediate experience of and dialogue with the most powerful forces of creation, in creation. And so there's a lot more to say about surrender, but I'm inviting you today to consider it as a practice, to consider where you are able to surrender in your life and where you're not. And ask yourself, why not? And ask yourself how that serves you. I'm inviting you to consider surrender as a position of power, surrender as a position of communion, surrender as an opening to a space of possibility, surrender and not knowing, despite how it feels on an emotional level, which is, yes, of course, it is. It's vulnerable. Yes, of course, it is scary. And it is quite literally the place where magic happens. So let us praise surrender today. And if you're someone who has a clear feeling for spirit, God in your life, then maybe you want to try a different word, which is faith, trust, which is not ignorance, which is not blindness. It is alignment with all that is. That sounds like a good place to be. All right. Oh, that looks like a good place to be too. I'll go see if I can fit in that little pink chair. All right, I'll see you soon.